Hello. So in this video for West Virginia Day 2025, we're going to talk about Frederick A. Barkey's Working Class Radicals, the Socialist Party in West Virginia, 1898 to 1920. So this is actually a reprint of Barkey's dissertation from the University of Pittsburgh in 1971. This version is published by WVU Press, West Virginia University Press. WVU is where I got my doctorate. But this is a 1971 history dissertation in what was then the emerging field of labor history. Labor history at the time was not all that well accepted within professional history circles. It is today much more established, and there's much better foundation for the methodologies and the backgrounds, theoretical foundations for labor history than Barkey had to work with in 1971. But he did really, really good analysis. So he did, things like archival research and stuff like this, looking into these different labor papers and socialist newspapers and things like this that were published in West Virginia in the early 20th century. Things like the Labor Argus and I forget what some of the other ones are. One of them I remember was out of Wheeling, and it was like the Wheeling Labor and Socialist Star or something like that. I don't think that's quite right, but he goes through the archives of these different newspapers that were publishing these labor focused, trade union, industrial union focused, or socialist focused articles and things like this. The voice of the Socialist Party in West Virginia, the voice of the labor movement, and he talked extensively with people who had been active in the Socialist Party in the early 20th century, or with their family members, their surviving relatives, etc., etc. So he gathers all of this primary information about things like what sorts of workers were most prominently involved in the Socialist Party, what sorts of workers, and I'm talking partially demographically here, but also in terms of like what sorts of industries, what level of skilled labor or unskilled labor, semi-skilled labor, who was most involved in the Socialist Party and things like this. And so he gathers up quite a bit of information about this, and basically he, in the early portion of the dissertation, he gives some broad brushstrokes generalizations, right? Like one point that he makes that I think is incredibly important and that I personally quite like, is that the people who got involved in socialism, not just in West Virginia, this is pages roughly 68 to 70 that I'm really interested in here. The people who got involved in socialism in West Virginia, but this sort of aligned with a larger national trend, tended to be better educated than their compatriots who did not get involved in socialism. They tended to be people that, for instance, would be called studious, a great reader, talk about anything to you, best read person around here, inventive, loved mathematics, and crazy about good literature. So they tended to be very, very smart. They tended to be very educated, often autodidactic, that is, often self-educated. They would read broadly about different types of subjects, not just things like labor politics, but literature, arts, mathematics, science, etc., etc. And they tended to have very high levels of empathy, of social consciousness, of concern for others, etc., etc. Whereas, those things sort of exceeded the averages for other people. So that's sort of a general trend among people in the U.S. who were drawn to the socialist movement in the late 19th, early 20th century. But it holds true based on the data that Barkey has gathered. But he also talks about how, for instance, it was primarily skilled labor that was drawn to socialism and that was drawn to the union movement. So part of this would be things like glass makers, tin makers, who were predominant in the northern part of West Virginia, around the Wheeling area. And often those were Belgian or French immigrants who had come and had these glass-making skills, these tin-working skills, these sort of fine industry backgrounds, and they brought their background in socialism, their background in cooperative labor control of production from Europe to West Virginia. And so they were very much rooted in that, and they brought it to West Virginia. But then you also had the miners, and the miners throughout the entire state of West Virginia, including right here where I'm actually filming this, in Fairmont, West Virginia. The miners were very, very often primed to accept socialist ideas because of the conditions of the miners. And so one of the things that Barkey says when he's talking about this early in the sort of emergence of the West Virginia Socialist Party, he says, many miners in West Virginia saw the need to organize themselves for very practical and immediate reasons. The wages in 1897 averaged about $275 per year, the lowest in the nation, with the possible exception of the Pittsburgh area where cheap immigrant labor was available. Furthermore, wages were based on a confusing patchwork of payment in which some men were paid on a long ton basis, while others received payment per short ton. To this was added persistent complaints as high rent, exorbitant prices charged at the company store, and the general paternalistic practice common to isolated coal communities. So, because of the conditions of West Virginia miners in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were very receptive to these anti-capitalist arguments. And indeed, one of the things that in the sort of late 1890s up through, say, 1905 or so, one of the things that the socialists felt that they needed to do was to build on the already existing resentment and anger toward the coal operators, the coal mine owners, through processes of class consciousness raising, to help miners to understand more clearly what I think probably many of them intuitively understood, which was that their struggles as miners were connected to the struggles of not just, say, the glass workers, the tin makers, the stogie rollers, whatever it was within West Virginia, or to coal miners in places like Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Virginia, wherever it is, but to a broader conception of a national or international working class, right? That the exploitation of miners in West Virginia was connected to the exploitation of, say, factory workers in New York. In, say, my hometown of Rochester, Rochester was an industrial town historically. and the struggles of the factory workers in a place like Rochester were connected with the struggles of the miners. This was one of the early things that the Socialist Party felt that they needed to address with the miners, because the miners had this intuitive understanding, this intuitive response to the systems of oppression and repression that they experienced in their day-to-day lives. One of the other things that sort of laid the groundwork for a swell of popularity among the socialists was that both the Democratic and Republican parties, and remember, this is the Democratic and Republican parties of the 1890s through the 1920s, so they're very different parties than they are today, but both of them consistently betrayed the interests of the miners and of the broader working class. And I would argue generally across the board that this is still true. Republicans especially today demonstrate excessive disdain for the interests of workers. They are anti-union, and the union is the best mechanism that workers have for getting a fair deal from their employers. They attempt to divide the working class consistently along racial, gender, sexuality, ethnic, religious lines, etc., all of which weakens us as a working class against the interests of the wealthy and the powerful who seek to increase their wealth and power at our expense. And that was true very, very much in West Virginia in the late 19th, early 20th century. Both parties would frequently have politicians who campaigned on the basis of helping the working man, and it was very much the working man at that point in West Virginia, even though realistically women did massive amounts of labor, both domestically and on, for instance, farms and things like this. Incidentally, farmers did not tend to take much of an interest in socialism, according to Barkey's research. But both parties would campaign on the basis of, we will improve conditions for the working class. And politicians of both parties consistently betrayed those promises. You might be shocked to hear that. Again, I think this is still very much the case. Neither party is particularly supportive of the interests of working class people. I would say more Democrats are interested in it, but I would say the Democratic Party as a whole fails to meaningfully create beneficial change for workers most of the time. And the Republicans are just actively hostile to anybody who's not ultra-wealthy. But because there was this sense of disenchantment with both of the political parties, and because so much of West Virginia had, again, these largely Belgian and French tin workers, glass workers, specialist craftspeople in places like Wheeling who were already primed with socialist ideology, large groups of German and Italian miners who, again, brought the ideology of socialism, of anarchism, etc., from Europe to the coal fields of West Virginia, and this homegrown antipathy to the mine operators who, at every turn, would exploit and betray the mine workers. West Virginia was at one point seen by many people, the United Mine Workers of America, Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party establishment, as well as others. It was at one point in around, say, 1910, 1911, 12, that sort of period, it was thought that West Virginia would lead the United States in a move toward a much stronger, dominant socialist party that would become a viable challenger to the main two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. That, of course, did not happen. And it is interesting. The first lines of Barkey's dissertation are, "It's difficult to convince most Americans that their country has had a significant socialist tradition," right? The fact that the socialists ultimately did not win out for a number of reasons, and Barkey goes through them in sometimes not really very interesting detail, but for a number of reasons, like internal divisions, splits between the socialist and non-socialist labor movement, corruption as the Socialist Party, and especially as branches of the United Mine Workers of America and other trade or industrial unions gained strength, corruption within those institutions, disagreement about tactics, things like this. And then later, as you get toward, say, 1918, 1919, especially into 1920, you get a division about whether or not the American Socialist Party should support the Bolsheviks in the emerging Soviet Union, and the early enthusiasm for the Bolsheviks really did not play well with a lot of non-socialist Americans, and so you have I think it's generally classified as the second Red Scare. I think the first Red Scare is of the 1890s or so, and then there's another Red Scare in the late 1910s, 1920s. And so all of those things really substantially weakened support, as did sort of differences among socialists and trade unionists, industrial unionists, craft unionists, about how much effort should be put into running socialist candidates versus trying to back Democratic or occasionally Republican candidates and then put pressure on them to improve conditions for labor, versus how much electoral politics should be disregarded completely in favor of revolutionary action and direct action, which are still debates going on the left today. Particularly the question about whether or not electoral politics is even worth pursuing. Although in the U.S. it's worth noting, we don't have a substantial organized left-wing revolutionary movement. So all of these things are going on. At the same time, you have these sort of questions about things like union-negotiated contracts and those not being lived up to by the coal operators. You have various strikes that go on, often quite violent strikes. And when I say violent, I mean violently repressed in most instances. The Cabin Creek, Paint Creek strike of 1912 was a massive walkout of, if I'm remembering correctly, Paint Creek was unionized, Cabin Creek was non-unionized. The Paint Creek workers went out on strike, and the Cabin Creek workers walked out with them, basically. And the mine operators hired Baldwin Felts thugs, who were basically private guards hired to come and shoot at the miners. The miners were driven from their homes. Many of them lived in tent camps with their families. They were regularly subject to attack by both private security forces like the Baldwin Felts thugs and by attacks by. Well, so the role of the West Virginia State Militia here is a really sort of interesting one. They sort of the National Guard, because initially they did seem to come in and act as a peacekeeping force, but they very quickly. Their role very quickly shifted to being on the side of the mine operators and against the miners. And so you had the actual military arrayed against the miners, against the forces of labor. And so it was this very incredibly violent strike. And then, Barkey's period he's really interested ends in 1920, which is a year before the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, August to September of 1921, which is the largest militant labor action in U.S. history. And it involved the United States Army, including the burgeoning Army Air Corps, attacking striking miners. That is the only use of what would become the United States Air Force. It was the only air-based attack by the United States military within the U.S. in history, was to attack striking miners who were trying to fight for better conditions. And ultimately, one of the things that I think is so important about Barkey's dissertation about working class radicals is that today people have too often forgotten this, that West Virginia was once one of the most radically left-leaning, pro-labor, anti-capitalist states in the country. There were elections like 1912 where West Virginia Socialists posed a serious electoral threat to the established parties. They got enough votes. And throughout this period that Barkey is looking at, they regularly put people into local offices, mayors, justices of the peace, things like this. The Socialist Party was a force to be reckoned with, which is part of the reason why the Democratic and Republican establishment and the forces of capital arrayed behind the mine owners cracked down so heavily on it. But West Virginia has this tremendous radical tradition, this tremendous left-wing tradition where people saw their struggles as miners, as working-class people living in poverty, living in oppression by the capitalist system, etc., as part of a global workers' struggle. And they let that empathy, they let that sympathy, they let that desire for improved global conditions guide their politics. Today, West Virginia is the most stridently Republican state in the United States, as far as I know. The last data that I saw was that there is a larger percentage of registered Republicans in West Virginia than any other state, at around 68%. The men and women and the children who fought at the Cabin Creek Paint Creek strike and who fought at the Battle of Blair Mountain, their tradition can be reclaimed.